In the brief span of the Homo sapiens' evolutionary existence on this planet, it has in but a speck of Earth's history managed to reproduce, migrate and spread its presence to almost every corner of the world, gradually surpassing every other species on the planet to take its place as the world's dominant apex predator, uncontested and unrivaled by anything else. However, humanity's pro-social capabilities that served us so well in terms of security through strength in numbers would ultimately prove to be our greatest weakness as well, as within the dense social structure of villages, towns and cities, any highly contagious virus would have all the suitable vectors it would ever need, and should a solution to an outbreak within a densely populated area prove futile, the results could be rampant, devastating, and ultimately have the potential to be the cause of our race's very demise. While it's still unclear when and where the first case of the corruption occurred, it didn't take long for it to spread among the smaller populated areas within the bayous of Louisiana. And while diseases and bacterial infections wasn't an uncommon occurrence in the damp and bug-infested area that the infection had chosen for its initial breeding ground, people were quickly noticing just how fast this disease was spreading and how unusual its effects were, should you be unfortunate enough to contract it. Speculations on the transmission of the disease itself remain uncertain and inconclusive to this day, as no one seems to quite understand exactly how the disease managed to spread itself so quickly, whether through direct contact, droplets, if it was carried by air or vectors, or maybe all of the above. It certainly didn't help that the poor and unaware population of the bayous failed to take any methods of precaution in terms of containing the initial stages of the outbreak, if that would even have been possible. And while the transmission of the infection seemed fast and exposure to a lot of people happened within a small time frame, the symptoms that followed initial exposure were slow and agonizing. The initial onset of effects would mirror that of a simple flu, with fevers, tremors, and physical weakness within the victim. However, the second stage of the infection would manifest itself within the victim's brain, causing anxiety, paranoia, nightmares, and vivid hallucinations, making the victim question their own reality as the inevitability of insanity would slowly encroach on them. In this second stage, the victim would be prone to extreme anger, violent outbursts, and have an inclination to maim and cripple others through severely sadistic methods of abuse and torture, making them an immediate danger to anyone in their vicinity. Whether or not the victim was contagious in this stage is unknown, but allegedly, victims would describe an unyielding desire for the taste of raw meat, constantly feeling hungry and unsatiated, no matter how much they ate. In the third and final stage, the infection would take a hold of the victim in its entirety. Blackouts would occur where the victim would go on murderous rampages, awakening in a pool of someone else's blood deep within the swamps, without any recollection of the events. However, one thing was always the same after the blackout: the taste of blood in their mouth. The blood of someone else. Not long after the onset of the third stage of infection, the victim would ultimately meet its demise, dying to what would seem like natural causes to anyone that hadn't experienced the violent change in personality. These symptoms and their severity seemed to differ depending on the location of its victims. While the outskirts of the bayous were initially untouched or barely affected, its victims dealt with long periods, sometimes months of suffering, before finally succumbing to the infection. The deeper parts of the swamp, however, were affected much quicker, seeming to perish within days, if not hours, once the infection had taken a hold of them. It almost seemed like there was a source for the corruption, nestled deep within the bayous, whose immediate presence, not unlike a source of strong radioactivity, emitted a corrupting force that became more and more deadly the closer one came to ground zero. However, It wouldn't take long before the fear of the virus itself was replaced by something far worse. For the dead, both the recently deceased and the ones that had already been mourned and buried, would suddenly come back to life, once again walking the earth as mere husks of their former selves. These abominations that would later be labeled as grunts were confined to the most basic desire of any organism: the need to feed. The lack of documentation for when and where the first grunt occurred, the so-called patient zero, leaves much room for uncertainty and speculation of how the events exactly unfolded. But what is certain is that when the grunts rose from the dead and started roaming the swamps, the situation has suddenly become much more volatile. For while the source of the corruption, residing somewhere deep within the bayous, would slowly eat away at the inhabitants in the surrounding areas, any physical contact with these grunts would drastically accelerate the process of the infection. Any scratch, bite, or simple break of the skin caused by these monsters were a certain death sentence, and as the grunts continued to rise from their graves, the rate of casualties rose as well. Within months, the infection had killed off hundreds within the bayous and infected even more. Initially suspected by outside parties to be the yellow fever, the people surrounded by the infection, still unaware of the supernatural phenomenon occurring within their population, was certain it was something else. They just weren't sure what. Rumors of plagues, rabies, mass insanity, and collective madness ran rampant, and the people called for immediate aid from the local politicians, begging them to intervene and help. These calls, however, would go unheard. Left to fend for themselves, stuck in the middle of this unfolding chaos with the dead walking among them, the population within the bayous realized there was no outbreak of insanity, and even worse, no one was coming to help them. Having to make do with what little tools and resources they had at their disposal, their wooden sheds, shacks, and shanties were barricaded, and spiritual walls with holy incantations were positioned around the constructions in a desperate last attempt to gain help from any higher entity that might still have been watching over them. With hopes dwindling as the population slowly fell to the corruption, desperate measures were taken in trying to understand and hopefully fight the corruption. Autopsies done by survivors within the barricaded shelters would reveal several shocking revelations, revealing the very cause of the illnesses and strange effects that had plagued the population and its victims. This discovery would be labeled by the medical practitioners as the corruption itself. This phenomena existed within the bodies of all the victims, where it took form as a fixed substance with the same color and consistency as tar. This substance would gradually replace every ounce of blood within the victim, and would upon death continue to pulse through the body. The substance would seem to originate from the heart, which also seemed to be the only organ directly affected by the corruption. The heart would grow deformed and spherical, while its color would turn dark and black, before its surface and texture would become venerated, like the wings of a horsefly. This corruption that was pumped out into the body's veins would feed huge amounts of larvae, now living in every vein of the body. These larvae would later become moths, flies, and other sorts of insects, hatching within the victim. What the purpose and function of these insects might have been is still unclear to this day. Speculations were made by certain medical practitioners that this substance, the corruption, was the driving force behind the grunts, almost as if some higher entity was controlling their bodies against their will, and that the victim was still alive somewhere within. This invisible force was puppeteering these lost souls trapped within their horrific cage of otherworldly torture. Similar observations were also made by local individuals with deep ties to voodooism, labeling these grunts as zombies, which in Haitian folktales is an individual being controlled against their will by dark magic. So once again, the question would arise, was there a source for this corruption? And was it this source of corruption that was controlling the grunts? while the local population would remain completely clueless as to how to identify, avoid, or even deal with this rampaging nightmare, stuck as merciless victims in a deteriorating environment where even the terminal aspect of death seemed an uncertainty. An outsider, completely unrelated to the situation, had through his contacts heard of the outbreak and had immediately identified the sole problem and the source of the corruption. This outsider decided that it was his duty to intervene where no one else would, so with the intent of saving the population, he would set course towards Louisiana to find an end to the evil that had befallen us all. Hey there, Hazmat here. This was only part 1 of the story of the corruption, so stay tuned for more. As always, a big thanks goes out to the Hunters Lounge on Patreon, who helps me decide on future content and which you can join for $1 a month. The link is in the description below. A big thanks goes out to Tip and Rexley from the Hunt Showdown Discord, who as always proved to be human encyclopedias of lore and knowledge. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.